I call this hearing of the Senate Communications and Technology Committee to order, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the final hearing in our series of hearings discussing how we can better improve access to high-speed broadband internet across our Commonwealth. And throughout my time in the House and now here in the Senate, I've been working to clearly define the size, scope, and magnitude of the broadband challenge in Pennsylvania. And this time last year, the number we all were using was 800,000. That's the number people believe to not have access to high-speed internet in the Commonwealth. We now know, thanks to the Center for Rural Pennsylvania, that actually only a small portion of Pennsylvania meets the FCC's minimum speed for broadband of 25.3 megabytes per second. The number of people without access or who have a discrepancy in actual speeds versus advertised speeds is actually in the millions. Marginal broadband connectivity is a Commonwealth-wide problem, but the issue becomes exceedingly worse throughout most of rural Pennsylvania. And that is why it was imperative to hold these hearings with this committee to begin to examine the problem and find workable solutions. We've met in some of the state's most rural areas like Indiana, Fayette, and Monroe counties. Some, like Indiana, were so remote that there wasn't even access to broadband at the actual committee hearing, nor cell phone service. It was probably the most gratifying experience to have the full and undivided attention of the people in our audience. So we wanted to gather information from every area that's impacted from a lack of high-speed broadband. So we heard from the agriculture community, the healthcare community, local governments, education, job creators, and so many more. And today we'll be hearing from groups about what is being done in other states and hopefully gather some concrete solutions for Pennsylvania as we move forward. So I'd like to kick off things today with our first panel. And joining us is Secretary Kurt Topper, Department of General Services, Sherry Collins, the Acting Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Broadband Initiatives, and her title is longer than my name, and Matthew Bembenek. Thank you, from the Department of General Services. And we will start with your opening remarks. Of course, I would ask that you please summarize as much as possible so that we will have ample time for your questions following all of your opening remarks. And before we get started, if you could please stand and raise your right hand to be sworn in. Do you swear that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And if so, indicate by saying I do. Thank you very much. Secretary Topper, if you would like to begin.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to answer your questions. We have prepared fairly detailed written testimony. I'd be happy to forego reading it this morning so that we can get directly to your questions. The one key point in the testimony that I would just like to underscore as we get started is simply the distinction that we've tried to make between the effort to leverage the Commonwealth's assets in order to maximize the return that we get on those assets by making those assets available to third-party wireless providers, and the larger challenge of providing a solution to the rural broadband problem in Pennsylvania. At DGS, our agency, we've been pretty engaged over the last 3 years in the former challenge, that is leveraging our assets and trying to drive revenue. We have been less directly involved in the rural broadband challenge, in large part because it is historically not within the purview of the Department of General Services to take on a challenge like that. As I'm sure most of the panel is aware, DGS tends to operate in the background. We tend to be very focused on the operations of the Commonwealth. We're the Commonwealth's real estate manager. We're the Commonwealth's procurement and contracting leader, and we handle construction and things of that nature. We do not typically get that involved as a department in the more public-facing challenges such as rural broadband. So our efforts as a department have really been focused on, again, trying to maximize the return that we get on the Commonwealth's substantial portfolio of real estate assets. That is how we started to approach this problem, and it's sort of where we've ended up after a period of about 3 years, during which we learned a little bit about the Rural Broadband Challenge, and we'll be pleased to share those insights this morning. But I think the testimony speaks for itself, and I'd be happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Secretary Topper. Director Collins.
Good morning. Thank you, Senator. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today with my colleagues from the Department of General Services. As you're aware, I did not submit written testimony as the request for my participation this morning was somewhat late notice on Friday, but always happy to be here before this committee and to share with you some of the work that we're doing in the Governor's Office of Broadband Initiatives. As the Secretary mentioned, the broadband challenges that we have in Pennsylvania have never really had a home as far as state government is concerned. It's an issue that has been one that has been ongoing for many, many years, and under Governor Wolf's leadership, he created the Office of Broadband Initiatives. And I think that that's important to note because I think, as you'll all know, this particular issue runs far and wide across Pennsylvania. We have connectivity issues in both rural Pennsylvania, and then we have issues that are in more of our urban centers as well, but the issues are distinctly different. The issues in rural Pennsylvania are oftentimes a result of limited infrastructure, and in urban areas, more densely populated areas, it becomes a matter of affordability and adoption by those individuals in those communities. But in my office, my effort is really focused on trying to identify ways in which we can expand Pennsylvania's infrastructure so that we can, in fact, target that last mile connectivity, that we are providing services to the residents of Pennsylvania, especially in areas of rural Pennsylvania, as well as to our businesses. We know that having access to infrastructure and broadband connectivity is vitally important if we choose to move Pennsylvania forward. We know that this is a great state. We know that we have an awful lot of opportunities, but this is one challenge that is very big and very difficult to solve, and I think that that's something that we have all recognized. So again, I thank you for allowing me to be here today and to participate in this very important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you being here, and you've been present at, I think, almost every one of our hearings, and that's been noted, and appreciate your leadership as well. So, Mr. Secretary, if I may, Senate Bill 470, which would require your department to conduct an inventory of all state-owned assets for the deployment of broadband, is currently in the State Government Committee. There's a companion bill from the House, Representative Snyder's legislation, that's also in the State Government Committee. It came to our attention, and we've had conversations, that DGS released an RFP for an asset manager to do essentially what that legislation had called for. I've been of the opinion that we should work within our means, and by having existing DGS staff work on a project like this, hopefully responsibly use taxpayer dollars. Could you please provide an update of what exactly DGS is doing in regard to that contract for an inventory of state assets? And briefly, just a quick progress report on what has been done.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. DGS executed the contract with Agile Networks on August 23rd of this year. So we are really just getting started with Agile as the Commonwealth's new asset manager for wireless assets. We conducted an inventory to the extent that accurate and adequate data was available. We conducted an inventory of Commonwealth assets that could potentially be used for the purpose of deploying additional wireless capacity in 2017. That inventory was conducted with the assistance of a group of students and faculty from Carnegie Mellon University as a capstone project for one of their master's programs. It's a great way to get free consulting here for the Commonwealth. They're very qualified to do it. We provided for them basically the Commonwealth's entire database of real estate assets, as well as what we knew about the locations and capabilities of every tower that was already built and present in the Commonwealth. And CMU did a nice job of building all of those assets into a GIS database that became the basis of the RFP that we issued, and that Agile was ultimately successful in being awarded. From our perspective, we feel like the inventory that the bill calls for is largely done. There may be a reason, there's likely reason as we move forward to continue to update that inventory as the portfolio of Commonwealth assets changes, and as the nature of assets that are amenable to use for the purpose of wireless changes, because as you know, the technology changes fairly significantly here over time. Our understanding is that as we move forward, we're going to be talking less and less about existing towers and tower sites, and talking more and more about rooftops and other locations that we may not have contemplated historically, but that may actually prove to be quite beneficial from the perspective of the third-party wireless providers to whom we are trying to market those assets. So the inventory includes all real estate assets in addition to all current towers. As I said, that was completed in 2017, and Agile is now using that inventory as the basis of the contract as they get started and begin to make overtures to the wireless providers on our behalf in an effort to get them to include Commonwealth property in their plans as they think about how they're going to spend their capital money going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. On the contract itself, if we could kind of shift gears a little bit. When we met last week, I had requested a copy of the RFP, the responses to the RFP and the contract. We've not yet received that. When can I expect to obtain that information?
We should have that for you later today.
Okay, very good. Out of curiosity, how many responses were received in response to that RFP?
There were 3 responses received.
Okay. I had read through Capital Wire that there was only 1 that had been received.
That's incorrect.
Okay, very good. We also learned that the Department of General Services, in your testimony to the Senate State Government Committee with regard to real estate modernization, that you only have the ability to enter into leasing agreements for 5 years. From what has been reported with regard to this contract, my understanding is that this contract is for 20 years. So can you talk about how you have the authority to execute this contract?
I'd be happy to, Senator. I think that it's I think that it's a question perhaps better directed to counsel, and I am not here representing the counsel for the office or for the Commonwealth. But we, as we got started to put the contract together, we asked the question: what do we have the authority to do in this area? Given that prior contracts with state police had already provided for the ability for state police's contract with Crown Castle to enter into long-term 20-year agreements. I believe they called them site license agreements as opposed to leases. Basically, agencies had previously found the authority to be able to leverage those assets, and really for the benefit of the Commonwealth and for the benefit of the taxpayer. What I was trying to speak to in the context of the real estate modernization hearing was whether the statutory authority that attends to the Commonwealth's management of real estate was sufficiently clear so that there could be really no dispute about the Commonwealth's ability to enter into longer-term leases, not just for wireless assets, but really for, in fact, primarily for property. Right? So the Commonwealth is both a landlord, both a lessor and a lessee, And there are instances where the Commonwealth, where it's to our benefit to be able to enter into leases that are longer than 5 years in both cases. So the bottom line for us is that the agency does not require statutory action or legislative action in order to do what we've done with the Agile contract. The state police did not need legislative action in order to do what it had already done with Crown Castle in the context of their contract. What I was speaking to in the context of real estate modernization was really about whether the statute was as clear as we would like it to be, since really what that agency was about, or what that hearing was about, was effectively a recodification of all of the statutes that attend to the way we manage real estate.
But in
that's
that
really what we're talking
testimony, you
about.
also talked about service line agreements as part of this. So my understanding when you testified that it was a broad range of issues, not specifically real estate, but other things involved with potential real estate. So if we could, the valuation to the taxpayer with regard to this lease, I have read $18 million. I've read $100 million. So can you just briefly talk about the finances of this contract?
Sure. So the contract is arranged as a gain share. So basically, the Commonwealth will incur no cost up front for Agile to get started and to begin attempting to leverage the Commonwealth's assets in order to bring in revenue. They will market our assets to the Verizons and the AT&Ts of the world. Our hope and our expectation is that those wireless providers will see the Commonwealth's real estate assets as valuable as they build out their own portfolio and their own networks here across Pennsylvania, and that we will be able to earn rent on those locations as they either add to our towers or build new towers on Commonwealth property, or if they want to erect a microarray on top of the North Office building. This would be the mechanism through which we would market that availability and through which we would earn revenue. We believe that once the contract is fully up and running, that it could earn as much as $5 million a year across all of the portfolio of Commonwealth assets.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Chairman Sanacero?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to start by, again, thanking you for your leadership on this issue. And thank all of our witnesses who are here today for testifying. And apologize for missing the last two hearings, but I was in the hospital with pneumonia at the beginning of September, which is an odd time of year to have that particular malady, but it is what it is. But actually, what I was interested in was what you just spoke about, Mr. Secretary. So the total amount of revenue that you estimate we would be able to bring in by leveraging the state assets is $5 million a year?
That's our estimate, yes.
Okay, and that's across all potential assets that could be used for that purpose in the Commonwealth?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ms. Collins, thank you again for your testimony back in Indiana County. It was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Stefano.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Secretary, just real quick, you mentioned real estate assets of the state, and you've talked about towers. Can you highlight just briefly some of the other assets that you're speaking of that you're looking at this contract that could be useful in broadband initiatives?
Thank you for the question, Senator. So the Commonwealth owns approximately 8 million square feet of office space, warehouse space, state police barracks, those kinds of facilities all across the Commonwealth. We also own significant tracts of land through primarily through DCNR, and all of that property is potentially leverageable for the purpose of either erecting towers or other capabilities here in order to deliver wireless. The challenge is bringing power to the site, because much of that property would require fairly substantial investment in order to bring power to where you need it.
Thank you for the clarity.
Sure.
Thank you. Secretary Topper, the contract, is this specifically for the deployment of broadband?
Yes.
Okay. What assurances do we have that the information gathered by the third-party asset manager will actually help Pennsylvania in its goal of providing broadband to underserved and unserved areas?
Well, Senator, as we discussed last week, the contract is intended for the purpose of leveraging the Commonwealth's assets in order to drive incremental revenue.
So the contract, when Representative Snyder and I drafted the legislation, it was with the purpose of further deploying broadband to unserved and underserved areas. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying, this is about monetizing our state-owned assets, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. But how are we going to address the unserved and underserved areas of this Commonwealth with regard to broadband?
Senator, after working on this issue for the last 2 to 3 years, I do not believe that Senate Bill 470 by itself is anywhere near sufficient to solve the rural broadband problem. The challenge is that the Commonwealth's owned assets by themselves are not sufficient. The constraints that the wireless providers face in the marketplace amount to more than the availability of land or real estate or buildings upon which to erect their technology. There's a lot more privately owned and available real estate in the Commonwealth than the Commonwealth owns. And I would just suggest that although it's possible that this contract could make a dent in the rural broadband issue, this contract by itself, it doesn't come close. It won't provide the revenue or the amount of capital that's necessary in order to solve that problem. It's just, unfortunately, it'd be nice if our assets alone were enough to solve the problem. But our analysis and our experience over the last 3 years suggests that it's just not the case.
I appreciate that, Secretary Topper. Certainly, I never drafted it thinking that it was the sole solution to the challenges that we face. So essentially, you're saying there's no specific language in the contract that would require Agile to focus its efforts on unserved or underserved areas, correct?
We have had ample discussions with Agile about that challenge. I don't know that specific language remains in the contract. Thank you, Matt. There's no specific language in the contract with respect to rural broadband. Naturally, they would like to be a part of that solution. And as I said, I think it could make a dent, but it's, as it turns out, the assets that are potentially most profitable aren't necessarily the assets that reside where we have the rural broadband problem. If those places in the Commonwealth were most profitable, we'd already have broadband there.
Okay. Thank you. So in looking at where Agile has executed similar contracts, looked at Indiana and Ohio, Indiana ultimately determined not to enter into that contract. And from what I was able to ascertain from research, opposition identified discriminatory and non-transparency of the entire process. Ohio executed the deal despite similar opposition about a lack of transparency and process. Can you talk about how the Commonwealth is certain that we're getting the best and fairest deal possible for these services, and what you will do about potentially discriminatory and non-transparent processes?
Sure, Senator. I can't speak to what occurred in Indiana or in Ohio, although I am familiar with the Ohio contract. What I can tell you is that the contract was competitively awarded. There were 3 competing proposals that were considered. That is how the Commonwealth primarily ensures that when we have a contract to award, that it's done fairly and that it's done in a manner that is transparent. I honestly can't speak to Indiana because I don't know the details there. I know that the contract in Ohio is substantially different than the contract that we've awarded here in Pennsylvania, in that the contract in Ohio also entails sufficient or a significant commitment on Ohio's part to allow Agile to provide backhaul services, to have a role in the state of Ohio's internal networks. We have not made the Commonwealth's telecom business available to Agile in the same way that Ohio has. Our contract is substantially different than that. The scope of our contract is significantly smaller. The scope of our contract is entirely about the packaging, the marketing, the bundling of the Commonwealth's assets, and making them available to third parties in order to earn revenue. It is exclusively about that. It does not entail any of the content that is currently part of Agile's relationship with Ohio.
Thank you. I look forward to receiving it, sharing the information with our colleagues. Look, the legislature is clearly supportive. I think this committee is clearly supportive of expanding broadband into rural parts of our Commonwealth and addressing any potential problems in the more urban and suburban parts of our Commonwealth. Encouraging all types of technology. We know there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I've had great concern about an exclusive contract relationship potentially being anti-competitive and in opposition to all the other efforts of all the other providers in the Commonwealth. We know that one entity is not going to be able to do this. So, I think it is imperative that we ensure good and fair policy across the Commonwealth for this issue. So, do any of my colleagues have any other questions before we bring up the next panel? We're good? We're good. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Senator.
it. We will now move on to our second panel. And joining us today for this part of our discussion are Sasha Meinrath, who is the Palmer Chair in Telecommunications at Penn State University. And I know that I've left off a large part of his title. He can fill you in. Mr. Brent Skorup, Senior Research Fellow, Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and Catherine DeWitt, Manager at Pew Charitable Trust's Broadband Initiative. And welcome. We're very happy to have you all here. And again, if you could please summarize your opening remarks as much as possible to allow us to ask many questions, we would really appreciate it. So if we can start with Mr. Meinrath.
Thank you, Chairwoman Phillips-Hill, and thank you also Minority Chair Santar-Sierra and members of the committee for this opportunity to discuss the current state of broadband connectivity in Pennsylvania. As mentioned, I'm the Palmer Chair in Telecommunications at the Penn State University, but for the past dozen-plus years, I've also led broadband mapping efforts.
Mr. Meinrath, if I
Yes.
could, my apologies. I need to swear you all in. So
Yes,
if
please
I
do.
could ask you all to stand and raise your right hand to be sworn in. Do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And if so, indicate by saying, I do.
I do.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for interrupting. If you could continue, thank you.
Luckily, that affects my testimony not at all, but in 2006, I co-founded the Cooperative Measurement and Modeling of Open Networked Systems project over at the Center for Applied Internet Data Analysis at the San Diego Supercomputing Center. I've also founded the Open Technology Institute, a well-known DC-based policy think tank. In 2009, I created, along with a number of luminaries and researchers, the Measurement Lab platform. And in 2015, I founded the X Lab, which is a tech policy institute dedicated to vanguard research that is exactly why I'm here before you today. For this past year, my team and I were hired by the Center for Rural Pennsylvania to amass broadband speeds across the Commonwealth and report back to the center and to the legislature. Now, since its founding in 2009, the Measurement Lab platform has grown to become the largest collection of internet performance data on the planet. By leveraging the substantial resources of this platform, we've collected over 11 million broadband speed tests for Pennsylvania just in 2018. And along with our historic archive of another 15 million tests just for Pennsylvania, based our analysis on 25 million broadband speed tests conducted by residents across the state. I underscore the sheer scale of this effort because what we've documented is a dire crisis that is undermining our economy, our education system, our healthcare, our access to media and information, and the availability of untold additional resources that broadband connectivity makes possible. This is particularly disconcerting because the residents of Pennsylvania have already paid for a universal broadband service guarantee that was never delivered. When the state granted Verizon substantial tax breaks and rate flexibility, code for higher charges for Pennsylvania residents, we did so in return for a very clear commitment. And here I quote Verizon, quote, Bell commits to deploy the technologies necessary to provide universal broadband availability in 2015. In order to meet this commitment, Bell plans to deploy a broadband network using fiber optics or other comparable technology that is capable of supporting service requiring bandwidth of at least 45 megabits per second. While it's difficult to determine just how much money Pennsylvania residents have already paid for this commitment, Teletruth, the consumer watchdog group, has conducted a number of in-depth investigations looking at Verizon's SEC filings, their tax documents, and according to Teletruth's founder, Bruce Kushnick, quote, we estimate that by the end of 2014, Verizon Pennsylvania overcharged customers about $18 billion for a fiber optic future they never got. To this day, Verizon continues to state, as it does on its website even now, I checked this morning, that it has, quote, met its Chapter 30 obligations to deliver broadband to 100% of its Pennsylvania service territory by the end of 2015. Without broadband, individuals, households, and entire communities are put at a direct economic disadvantage. According to the National Bureau for Economic Research, broadband connectivity supplies roughly $2,000 a year in economic value. That's $2,000 per household, and it isn't just because of increased job prospects. It's cheaper flights, it's less expensive diapers, I know that one well. It's better medical information, it's access to untold online resources and cost savings. For communities without broadband connectivity, this means that they are hemorrhaging thousands of dollars every year from their local economy for every household that remains on the wrong side of the digital divide. And beyond this direct yearly cost, there are secondary effects. One that caused by the lack of broadband connectivity that directly impacts perhaps the most important asset most families have, their home. In May 2019, just a few months ago, researchers Stephen Deller and Brian Whitaker released a study of 887 rural communities looking at the effect of broadband connectivity on home value. Among their many interesting findings, one in particular stood out, and that is this, quote, higher access to broadband regardless of the specific estimator used, that's code for speed, has a positive impact on remote rural housing values. According to Deller and Whitaker, these results translate to a fairly extensive benefits. Quote, a 10% increase in coverage of at least 0.2 megabits per second results in a median house value increase of $661. Thus, for an underserved community, increasing even baseline connectivity to a simple majority of local households can have an impact of thousands of dollars per house. The researchers underscored this point in July 2019, where they estimated that, quote, annual property tax collections could increase $25,000 to $65,000 in rural counties, which could significantly which would be significant for rural areas that often struggle to fund local services. These property taxes are, of course, in addition to the wealth generation broadband creates for each individual home-owning family. The National Federation of Independent Business has found that the lack of broadband access, especially in rural areas, is harming startups and small business prospects as well. The NFIB claims, quote, for business owners in rural communities, broadband connectivity has become an issue they cannot ignore. As more industries and day-to-day operations rely on fast and reliable connectivity, areas that lack this essential tool are increasingly left in the dust. For far too many communities, this means that economic activity is being actively depressed. Not only are their businesses at a competitive disadvantage due to this lack of broadband, new businesses are moving away, and so are the entrepreneurs that create them due to the non-existent connectivity. In September 2018, the great folks at the Pew Research Center found that 24% of rural Americans claim that access to high-speed broadband is a, quote, major problem, with an additional 34% stating that lack of connectivity is, quote, a minor problem. Thus, only 4 in 10 respondents said that broadband access was not a problem in their communities. And over the past 15 years, home broadband has dramatically increased. For rural homes, from 10% to 58% between 2003 and 2018. But if you look more closely at these data, a highly problematic trajectory begins to emerge. According to Pew, in 2013, 70% of urban residents and 60% of rural homes were broadband users. So for rural communities, broadband connectivity has gone, and this is an odd fact, from 60% to 58% between 2013 and 2018. For urban constituencies, it's gone from 70% to 67% over that same time period. These implications are rather profound. For the past half decade, home broadband use hasn't meaningfully expanded. In 2015, the U.S. Census Bureau reported that Pennsylvania has 1.35 million rural households. Now, according to the FCC's highly optimistic estimates, roughly 40% of these households, or 540,000, do not have broadband connectivity. Taking into account the economic costs borne by these 540,000 households, as per the National Bureau of Economic Research's $2,000 a year opportunity cost, the current lack of broadband is costing rural Pennsylvanian residents over $1 billion a year in increased economic expenditures. Together with the $18 billion in overcharges and tax subsidies already paid to Verizon and other ISPs since the mid-1990s, the lack of universal broadband connectivity in Pennsylvania has likely already cost the state well over $25 billion. Over the past half decade, the Federal Communications Commission has published their national broadband map. Now, the United States has systematically released broadband speed information that, as our research documents, has become less accurate and less precise over time. The FCC collects self-reported data directly from internet service providers, or ISPs, who file what's known as Form 477. Now, the instructions for Form 477 allow an ISP to declare an entire census block as served even if only a single house in the geographic area has service. But the instructions also allow an ISP to declare an area served if they could theoretically provide service without what's called, quote, an extraordinary commitment of resources. So given these instructions, the information collected and then used by the FCC in their national broadband map grossly overstates broadband availability across the United States. And because there's no independent verification of these data, serious overstatements of ISPs have become commonplace. Let me give you one recent example directly impacting Pennsylvania. Upon reviewing official data disclosed by the FCC, the consumer watchdog group Free Press found something rather amazing. Quote, Barrier Communications Corporation claimed deployment of fiber to the home to census blocks containing nearly 62 million persons. We further examined the underlying Form 477 data and discovered that Barrier Free appears to have simply submitted as its coverage area a list of every single census block in each of the 8 states, including Pennsylvania, in which it claimed service. So to put it clearly, the official data showed that 100% of Pennsylvania had gigabit connectivity until an independent watchdog group pointed out that these data were simply too hyperbolic, even for the FCC to even be remotely plausible. Now, the fact that the FCC failed to identify such a massive error begs the question, how many additional and hopefully less egregious overstatements are still contained within this data set? Now, our work isn't meant to be a final say. It's meant to spur additional research and inquiry, as well as immediate action. We've provided the most comprehensive exploratory and comparative analyses of Pennsylvania's broadband connectivity ever conducted, but we're also keenly aware of just how much more work needs to be done. As part of the project team's analysis, 3 separate visualizations were conducted. Measures of broadband availability, as per the FCC's Form 477 data, measures of median broadband speeds experienced by ISP's customers via the tens of millions of speed tests we collected, and an assessment where these 2 separate measures agree and where they disagree. We developed hundreds of maps showing the differences between the FCC's data and our speed tests. We found that many communities experienced much, and I mean much, slower speeds than what the FCC was claiming was available. And our data showed that discrepancies between these official measures of broadband availability and on-the-ground speeds were systematic and appeared to be growing substantially over the past half-decade, especially in rural areas of the state. In essence, our data back up what the Pew Center found, which is that broadband deployment is beginning to flatline. But what we also identified is that official measures were systematically hiding this fact from the public by increasingly overstating broadband availability and speeds, and that overstatement increased most dramatically for rural areas. So today, anyone can look at these findings by going to our website, thebroadbandtest.us, clicking on the View the Map link, and investigating current and historical broadband speeds within their communities, counties, and legislative districts. Now, because MLab collects speed tests from across the United States, we collected 250 million of them in 2018 alone, we were also able to run follow-up analyses looking at how Pennsylvania is doing vis-a-vis other US states. And what we found is eye-opening. This is the first time we are releasing these data. Across the United States, 4 states, just 4, had median speeds that exceeded the minimum to qualify as broadband as per the FCC. And all 4, Maryland, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, were along the East Coast. Now overall, Pennsylvania's median speed of 17.3 megabits per second places us 12th in the country. However, amongst our peer states, those along this East Coast metro corridor, Pennsylvania is at the back of the pack. Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia all have faster median broadband speeds. To put it bluntly, looking at the East Coast, Pennsylvania is surrounded by states with faster connectivity speeds. which is particularly surprising since we are the only one of these states to have already invested some $18 billion of taxpayer money to provide universal broadband service. These initial assessments of the state of internet connectivity point to a major crisis that is particularly hard-hitting for rural residents. A lack of broadband connectivity has a direct economic cost of over $1 billion a year for rural households, and that cost is quite likely very conservative given that there are many non-rural households that don't have broadband access as well. Additionally, our lack of broadband is likely lowering home values across much of the state by additional billions, leading to a substantial loss of wealth from Pennsylvania families and tax revenue from the communities in which they live. Now, these are some fairly dire findings. I get depressed just reading this. So I want to conclude my testimony on an optimistic note. Our report for the Center for Rural Pennsylvania also documents solutions that have proven successful in bringing broadband connectivity to communities across Pennsylvania, to states across the country, and to nations around the globe. Looking to the future, we would be wise to investigate solutions that are already working elsewhere. And countless decision makers have already found innovative ways to make broadband investments that are already more than paying for themselves. For my part, I stand ready to assist these efforts in whatever way or ways would be most helpful. And thank you again for this opportunity to speak with you today. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I know I've probably mispronounced your name, so Brent, I will allow you to please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. No, you got it right. You got it right. Thank you. Good morning, Chair Phillips-Hill, Minority Chair Santacero, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Brent Skorup, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I also serve on the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee at the FCC, although my comments today are my own views and not necessarily those of the BDAC. It's commendable that lawmakers, governors, and mayors around the country, including Pennsylvania, are prioritizing broadband deployment. Lawmaker focus should remain on the pressing broadband issues of competition, deployment, and adoption. No one can accuse the government of doing nothing about rural telecom services. The federal government has spent more than $100 billion on rural telecom in the past 20 years. All dollar amounts in this testimony, by the way, are in 2018 dollars. Most of that total comes from the Federal Universal Service Fund, the USF, which disperses about $4.5 billion annually to rural providers across the country. In addition, the Pennsylvania USF redistributes about $32 million annually from Pennsylvania phone customers to phone companies serving rural areas. But do rural residents see all of these benefits trickle down to them? That seems doubtful. These programs are complex and spend subsidies in puzzling, uneven ways at times. Reform of rural telecom programs is urgently needed. FCC data suggests, for instance, that the current USF structure, the federal USF, disproportionately penalizes Pennsylvanians. A net $800 million has left the state from 2013 to 2017. I offer a few recommendations to bring broadband deployment to rural areas while preserving competition and fiscal restraint. Lawmakers, I hope, will consider the following: urging the FCC to transform the federal USF program into a rural voucher program, preventing unreasonable restrictions on the installation of small outdoor antennas on private property, and creating a vertical assets inventory for wireless providers to use in rural areas. First, the Federal Universal Service Fund, as I suggested, has a poor design that disproportionately penalizes Pennsylvanians. The federal USF was established in 1996 to make telecom services broadly available via subsidies. Telecom operators are required to contribute to the USF, which they do by imposing fees on their subscribers. These fees are sent to DC, the USAC redistributes it across the country, but many of the problems with USF result from this complex structure. Almost since its creation, the program has been dogged by waste and fraud issues. There are better ways to structure telecom subsidies. The USF dispenses subsidies unequally. The amount of high-cost funds the rural program dispersed per rural household varies immensely by state. In 2017, for instance, subsidies were most generous to Alaska, amounting to over $2,200 per rural household. Pennsylvania was near the bottom, about $63 per rural household. At the very bottom was Rhode Island, about 75 cents per rural household. Some variances to be expected naturally because of differences in geography and cost of build out, but $2,200 per rural household in one state and 75 cents per rural household in another state is one example of USF distortions. Perhaps more concerning is that Pennsylvanians are disproportionately penalized by these programs. Pennsylvanians pay far more into the USF than they receive. According to FCC records, in the 5-year period, 2013 to 2017, as I mentioned, on net, over $800 million left the state to be dispersed in other states. This year alone, Pennsylvania residents will pay about $400 million in USF fees. About half of that will return to Pennsylvania as subsidies to telecom providers participating in the 4 USF programs. The remaining $200 million, however, will be spread to other states for USF objectives. To put those numbers in context, if that $400 million remained in the state could give all 1.1 million rural households a $360 voucher to reduce their broadband bill, which comes to about $30 per month per rural household. So my recommendations are that I hope state officials and the PUC will urge flexibility from the FCC in transforming the high-cost USF for rural households in each state. Rural broadband vouchers would go a long way to leveling the competitive playing field and getting funds into the hands of rural customers who want service. Current federal policy, in contrast, only indirectly benefits rural households by subsidizing providers. Admittedly, a major reform like this will receive resistance from regulators and carriers. However, the USF program appears to be less and less effective as it ages. It's been over 20 years now. In my 2018 analysis to the Montana Public Service Commission, I found that USF subsidies over a period of 10 years grew 40%, despite a 30% decrease in the number of beneficiaries. I expect that other states see similar trends. My next suggestion is to prevent unreasonable restrictions on small outdoor antennas on private property. Cities and HOAs sometimes restrict the installation of broadband antennas on property. State could prohibit unreasonable restrictions similar to the FCC's over-the-air reception devices rules, which protect satellite dishes. These rules, the so-called pizza box rules, prohibit unreasonable restrictions on TV antennas. In most cases, unless there's a safety reason or historical site involved, the FCC prohibits fees and permitting requirements on antennas smaller than a pizza box. If the state were to supplement or complement the FCC's reforms to extend to broadband receivers, this could be a potentially powerful reform that helps wireless providers deploy equipment, especially in rural areas. Starry, a fixed wireless provider, said that if this reform, they said in comments to the FCC, if this were nationwide, they could extend their service coverage, fixed wireless service, to an additional 1 million homes with gigabit-capable broadband in the next year alone. And with the chair's permission, I'd like to add an illustration of this reform into the record.
Thank you. We would welcome it.
My final recommendation is to create a vertical assets inventory for wireless providers to use in rural areas. This idea came from vertical assets inventory came from Michigan's broadband report they completed a year or two ago. Some rural counties and cities want to make it easier for small fixed wireless providers to install facilities in rural areas. And so the county created a vertical assets inventory of towers, public buildings, water towers, grain silos, et cetera, so that providers could have a one-stop shop when looking for good siting opportunities. To conclude, broadband networks in the marketplace have changed dramatically since the 1990s when state and federal universal service programs were created. The laws and programs should change too. Pennsylvania especially is penalized by current programs since about $200 million leaves the state. The reforms recommended are not easy, but will empower providers and customers to bring broadband networks further faster. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much. Catherine DeWitt.
Good morning. My name is Catherine DeWitt, and I manage the Broadband Research Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts. Thank you very much to Chair Phillips-Hill, Minority Chair Santasiero, and the members of the committee for this invitation. I'm a Pennsylvania native. I'm from Pittsburgh, and I earned degrees at Penn State University and the University of Pittsburgh, so I have to admit that I'm very excited to be here today. The Pew Charitable Trust is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public charity that works to bring research and data to complex policy issues. And as you know, one of those complex policy issues is broadband. Internet has transformed industries and changed the way we access goods and services. It's changed the way we think about where we locate businesses, where we live, and where we send our children to school. It stands to become even more indispensable, yet researchers estimate that between 21 and 162 million Americans do not have access to broadband. And, as you all know very well, a recent study for the Center for Rural Pennsylvania concluded that the Federal Communications Commission's maps may vastly overstate coverage. As the chair mentioned earlier, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to ensuring that all Americans have access to broadband, but all efforts can benefit from more research and data-driven policy discussions. And that's what Pew aims to bring to this conversation. While much of the national conversation about broadband access has focused on federal and local governments, states have also stepped in to address this challenge. And my team is examining the activities states are undertaking to increase access to high-speed, reliable internet. Our first step was examining broadband deployment policy in all 50 states. That includes statutes, executive orders, and administrative codes. And we found that states are doing quite a bit to address connectivity. First, I'd like to point out that we are seeing broadband increasingly linked to policy areas outside of telecommunications, such as education, healthcare, and economic development. But overall, policy activity generally focuses in 5 key areas. States are establishing broadband programs and task forces. They're defining key terms in this area. They are implementing funding and financing efforts, governing infrastructure access, and addressing competition and regulation. Here in Pennsylvania, policies address regulatory authority, funding mechanisms, service provision requirements, mapping, and municipal broadband. So the takeaway from all of this policy research across the country is that state policy matters. States aren't just creating ad hoc programs or setting up funds or passing infrastructure legislation. They are creating a framework, a structure, or an agenda that other broadband stakeholders, including service providers, community leaders, and local governments can follow. We've posted all of this research in an online tool that you can find on our website. It's called the Pew State Broadband Policy Explorer. I will note that all of these policies are active as of January 1, 2019. There has been quite a bit of activity across the country in state houses this year, and we'll be updating that later this year. But I'm happy to take any questions on that if you have them. So what do we do with all of this research? We applied it to what we're calling our promising practices. About 15 months ago, our team started interviewing stakeholders across the country, other researchers, state broadband officers, elected officials, to identify what states seem to be doing well at closing these gaps in access. So we identified 10 states, and the research team went to all 10. They did 12 weeks of field research, interviewing state leaders, internet service providers, members of the community, and others who were engaged in these state broadband efforts to not only identify what states are doing to effectively close gaps in connectivity, but why they are actually working. And I'm happy to share some of these preliminary findings with you today. Our research has isolated another 5 key areas of activity. It's not a Pew thing, we just have found 5 in both of these areas of research. The first is stakeholder coordination and engagement. Then we looked at policy setting, planning and capacity building, funding and operations, and program evaluation and evolution. First, stakeholder engagement. Your policymakers, you don't need me to tell you the importance of engaging stakeholders when crafting and implementing solutions for communities. But what we found is that states are working across agencies and at the local level to better understand the challenges, get the right stakeholders engaged in the conversation, and develop solutions that work for everyone. Second, by setting policy, leaders are again creating that clear path for broadband. Policy states what broadband is, why it's important, who can provide it, what the state wants to do about it, and who is responsible for seeing those efforts through. Third, planning and capacity building at the state and local level have emerged as increasingly useful tools. They build buy-in, they build expertise, and they build awareness. And they often help facilitate better conversations between communities and providers. A number of people that we interviewed in states didn't refer to public-private partnerships, they referred to community-provider relationships. The fourth, and this is no surprise, is that program management and how programs are funded are also important. Interviewees cited how helpful it is to have an engaged state broadband manager, specifically because they act as a central point of coordination. You can find more information on how states fund broadband programs and what they fund on our website, but I'd like to flag 2 specific points for you while I'm here today. First, research points to the importance of sustained funding, even small amounts, because it helps providers of all sizes phase projects over time and come back for more work after they've completed initial grants. The second is that states are funding projects in different ways. I spoke earlier about how we're seeing broadband being linked to other areas outside of telecommunications. We're seeing that really come through in funding as states use things like community development block grant funds and industrial site development funds to support broadband deployment or planning. Second, we're seeing states repurposing high-cost telephone funds to support broadband deployment, and they're also establishing special funds for broadband deployment. The last area that we're reviewing is program evaluation and evolution. States are assessing their activities and measuring their progress. Then they are adjusting efforts to meet emerging needs or evolving goals, such as developing digital literacy programs. Broadband is foundational technology to so many of the major policy areas we talk about today: precision agriculture, distance learning, telehealth, and smart communities. All of these efforts rely on the availability of high-speed, reliable internet. PO aims to provide policymakers with clear, comprehensive research they need to expand broadband to the millions of Americans or Pennsylvanians still without access to high-speed, reliable internet. And we hope we can be partners in that process. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Meinroth, choose one or the other. They both work. You said before that there's been a private effort to get a better sense or arms around the areas that are in fact underserved. Mm-hmm. Do we have clear mapping on that?
It depends on how you define clear mapping. So one of the problems, if you will, that we have is that we want to protect the privacy, the specific geolocation of people taking these tests. Mm-hmm. And so we don't map down to the household level. I think that would be fantastic to look at. What we do instead is we aggregate by a geographic area. Mm-hmm. So we have very clear maps at sort of the zip code, the census block, the county, the legislative district level. And we don't know house by house what a specific household receives. That said, and again, I would encourage you to take a look at the report, we did proof out a methodology for using a feature of HTML5, a geolocation feature, to look at that level of specificity. Mm-hmm. I would say that would be a next logical study to start investigating. But the take-home message is really that these 2 data stores, right, broadband availability, which is one, and what people are actually receiving, which is a second data store. Mm-hmm. Areas where they agree most is in urban areas. Areas where they're most discrepant is in rural areas. And that discrepancy has grown over time. And that holds not just for millions of residents here in Pennsylvania. It's a phenomenon we've seen across the entire United States.
Right. And one of the reasons I ask is because the topography of Pennsylvania is varied. Mm-hmm. And that includes our rural areas as well. And it was one of the issues that was brought up actually at our first hearing back in early August. And that, of course, has an impact ultimately on what some of the solutions might be, mm-hmm. and the cost of those solutions and how we might approach that. So it seems to me that point one is having a really as specific a handle as possible on where we have problems to try to resolve those.
That is spot on. I would also add that without the cost of the solutions is an important variable. The cost of the service mm-hmm. is equally valuable. No one has yet collected systematically the pricing of broadband services. Why is it that people in rural communities in Pennsylvania are adopting speeds that are slower than in urban environments? I'm willing to bet every dollar in my pocket that it has at least a goodly amount of that is due to differential pricing for the same service. And in fact, the Wall Street Journal, I worked with them over the past couple months. They just came out with a report last month showing that broadband pricing amongst neighbors on the same street receiving the same service from the same provider can differ by up to 50%.
Wow. Thank you very much.
Very welcome.
Sasha, if I could follow up on Chairman Sanacero's question.
Absolutely.
A little different, but just your thoughts on the FCC's, what they've embarked on to redo their maps. I understand they are changing the way they identify areas. They're moving away from census blocks and moving to polygons. And then also they are redoing all the underlying GPS coordinates. First off, do you believe that will be successful in terms of better capturing an accurate read of where service is and isn't?
Right. So for those following this, those of us at this table, we know that the FCC issued a notice of proposed rulemaking on August 1st that said, we agree that our official maps are inaccurate and we're going to improve them. The question then becomes, is what's being proposed going to create a useful assessment, a science of broadband connectivity? And to that I would say, probably not. And probably not for a couple of key reasons. They will improve our knowledge of the geolocation where individual households or buildings are located. We'll know specifically where different places are. That won't stop the problem of hyperbolic self-reporting by the internet service providers. So we'll know precisely where the overstatements are, but it won't stop the overstatements. And to do that, we really need to have some sort of check and balance, right? I think it was Reagan that said, trust but verify. In this case, I agree with him. Like, without that, and without meaningful accountability, we are going to always then receive overly optimistic and hyperbolic information from the telcos. Now, the answer to this is very, very easy. You could put in a stipulation that just says, give us any assayance of where you provide service you want, but we're requiring that you actually provide service within, say, 30 days to every person in that area. That would be a very clear way to say, look, give us whatever information you think is most accurate, but then you must abide by it. And that's not even on the table. What's also not on the table is pricing. Pricing is completely missing from this August 1st notice of proposed rulemaking. And the FCC's own data shows that the number one, larger than any other factor in whether people adopt broadband connectivity. This isn't just going from zero connectivity to broadband. This is any form of connectivity to broadband connectivity. The number one factor is price, and we don't collect it.
Thank you. In several of the prior hearings, we've heard an awful lot about regulations that are in the way of further deployment. In all of your work, have you identified regulations that we currently have on Pennsylvania's books that could be eliminated to help us further deploy broadband across the state?
Yeah, I mean, as Brett mentions, a lot of our telecommunications policies are rather antiquated, and they make very inefficient use of existing resources, and certainly there's a lot that needs reform. We've kind of mortgaged systematic policy reform for a generation or two now. So in that regard, yes, there's many that could be streamlined and improved upon. I would also caution that the function of these regulations, especially in a non-competitive market, is to protect us, the residents and consumers of Pennsylvania. And so there's a yin-yang relationship between, say, a meaningfully competitive market where people actually could vote with our feet, and one where you have, in essence, geographic capture, where I may have one or no, but at best, right, the FCC says 96% of Americans have two or fewer wireline providers. So at best, we're operating in a duopoly. In that reality, in our reality, we need these regulations. We need the consumer protections. We need the accountability. But that said, I think we could make marked improvements to what exists right now.
I hope that's something that we can all work on going forward. I think, as we had said, that one piece of legislation that would inventory assets for the further deployment was certainly not the end-all be-all in terms of solving this problem, but I think there's probably a lot of different things that have to happen, based on what we've heard across the Commonwealth. And this would certainly be an important component. Mr. Skorup, you mentioned in your testimony that the state should conduct a vertical assets inventory for wireless providers to use in rural areas. Could you give us a little more detail about your recommendation as we are embarking on this? Where has this been successful, and what other information can you share with us?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And it sounds like you're well on your way to doing this, which, and this is new for all of us, this idea. On the BDAC, the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, this was one of the working groups was devoted to identifying federal property that would lend itself to, so real estate, buildings, towers, that would lend itself to wireless deployment and rights-of-way access as well, particularly for backhaul. So from what I can tell, these are all at their beginning stages. I mentioned in particular the Michigan Broadband Report, and I like that. There's a lot of things to commend in that report. They just serving as a venue for cities and localities and counties and state officials come together and discuss best practices. And so that came out of Michigan. I haven't seen any formal studies of how that's going. And also from that report was some rural counties were streamlining review of towers, and I believe the policy was if it was below 60 feet, it could get approved with mere administrative review. They had a more lengthy process before then in rural areas. But yeah, it's still at the beginning stages at the federal level and at the state level.
I sit on the FCC's Intergovernmental Advisory Committee. I'm actually missing their meeting today, so we can be here doing this important work. Understanding the limitations that you have in terms of speaking, but is the BDAC doing an actual report on this recommendation that at some point will be made public?
Yeah, there is a report on this topic, and there are recommendations. I can send you the report later today, but yeah, there is a report on that, and the members of the group. I mean, a major issue, as you know, is just raising this as a priority level for agencies, and that's what the BDAC accomplished, and just letting agencies know, hey, this is a priority for the FCC and for the administration, and that goes a long way. There were several agencies on that working group, but I can send you that report.
Thank you. I would appreciate that. I've been asking the same question since one of the representatives, Struzzi, out in Indiana, asked this question, just because it's been fascinating to hear, the huge dichotomy between the answers. But we understand that we need to figure out the size, the scope, the magnitude of the problem. We need to figure out how we're going to address this completely. But we also need to put a price tag on that. And so I'm going to ask all of you, and Sasha, you certainly really got down with those costs and numbers, but what do you estimate the cost to deploy broadband across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania will be based on your research?
Great. I'll step on that landmine first. So I think it's going to span depending on how willing we are to engage in things like asset sharing mandates and utilizing, in fact, existing infrastructure most efficiently, right? So different places on this planet, different countries have engaged in processes that make far more efficient use of available assets than the United States. But in 2009, we did a fairly comprehensive assessment of the cost for the United States, and we came up with a number of $430 billion for the entire U.S. This ended up, after 3 years, coming out as an executive order in 2012 that stripped out all the build-out mandates and just focused on things like making permitting more efficient. I think Mercatus and I would agree that pole attachment rules are a mess. And going to your question, there's an area that we could do major positive reforms. But we also need to be looking at where rent seeking and predatory pricing, et cetera, also exist. If I had to guess, given that we're now 10 years later, you're still looking at, for the state of Pennsylvania, a multi-billion-dollar investment. And when you look at the opportunity cost, the cost to Pennsylvania residents of not making that multi-billion-dollar investment, you realize that pays for itself. It has a return on investment of under a decade and probably more like 5 years, and that is, if my portfolio doubled in 5 years, man, I'd be excited. So that is a wise investment for the state to invest in. But to do so eyes wide open, with accountability, with documentation, that is the entire ballgame. Because we've already spent billions on subsidies that have proven to be less effective than states that didn't make those subsidies. So it's not just the cost, it's how we operationalize the build out that matters.
There we go. If I may, I'd like to push back on Sasha's assertion just a little bit. But I think what it is about what you want to do and how you want to go about doing it. We've seen in a number of states across the country that even small investments in these programs can make a significant change. And in some cases, this is about helping with community planning at the local level and getting communities to a place where they are broadband ready. And Senator Phillips-Hill, you asked earlier, how can communities, what regulations can be rolled back? Well, one thing that we've seen are the emergence of what are called broadband ready community certification. So there are 4 states that have certifications for communities that say, we have reviewed our local permitting processes. We've looked at our fees. We have established a single point of coordination at the local level. So that way providers have someone that they can work with in the community. And this community has the certification from the state saying, we're ready to go, we're investment ready. In other states, we've seen states invest in the middle mile. So that way they can encourage last mile deployment and decrease those costs for last mile providers. And in other cases, we've seen states just invest significant amounts of money in their overall broadband infrastructure. So I think it's a matter of, what do you want to do? How do you want to go about doing that? And then what level of investment you're willing to put into it.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. On the cost question, I don't know the Pennsylvania numbers. They may be out there. I haven't come across them. But just to give you a rough idea of the difficulty, a few years ago, one of the offices in the FCC estimated what it would cost to bring fiber broadband to all the households that currently don't have high-speed internet. The estimate from the FCC was about $80 billion to bring it to every unserved household. What I'd like to highlight is that it was the last 2% was half that cost. It was $40 billion to bring fiber to the last 2%. And certainly it will vary by state. Alaska and Idaho are very different than Pennsylvania. But you have that very difficult problem of financing networks that will never be profitable. By the way, the $40 billion for the last 2% would also need an annual $2 billion just to maintain the networks, because they will never be profitable. So it's an extremely difficult situation. That's why I favor in all the above approach, wireless, fixed wireless, phone companies, rural cable, and everything in between.
If I could just add, when we came out with a $430 billion number, people freaked out at us. But when you see that, according to the Mercatus Institute already, we've spent $100 billion in rural broadband build-out, and look what it's bought us. When you see that we are continuing to spend huge amounts of money, before you look at the opportunity costs, you realize this isn't a whole lot of money, because we get it back over time. And we're not operating in a vacuum here. A growing list of other countries have already solved this problem. And they've done so in many times for less than we're already paying for this current dysfunctional broadband system. So this is a real opportunity, not just to make wise investments, not just to modernize our regulatory structure, our consumer protections, et cetera, but also to solve a problem that our current trajectory is definitely not addressing by doing our own due diligence, figuring out what works and why, and implementing that at the state level while we wait for the federal government to make the necessary reforms I think we all know are needed, but it shows a dramatic reluctance to actually implement.
Just to build on points that both of the gentlemen made, this is where we're seeing also the difference in state broadband goals have an important role here. So in some cases, they are geographic. They want border-to-border coverage by a certain date. In other cases, they're based on population that reflect the fact that universal service may not actually be feasible in certain places of the country. For example, in California, their goal is to have 98% coverage and availability in their roughly 20 different regions. So this allows, and in other states, they're shooting for functional universal coverage, which has been one of the interesting things to emerge from this research. Basically, the goal is that anybody who wants broadband service in the state will have access to it by some point in the future. But this is where having that goal of what are we trying to do, what are we trying to build towards, and how do we want to go about getting there is very important.
Well, I thank you all very much. This has been very helpful. Appreciate your testimony here today.
Thank you.
And we are now going to move into our final panel of the day. And joining us are James D'Incenzo, Vice President of State Government for Comcast, Scott Kramer, Principal IT Specialist, CETA Council of Governments, and Bobby Kilmer, Board Secretary, the Fund for the Northern Tier. And I would like to thank you all for being with us here today. And again, ask that if you could, to summarize your remarks, we're actually remarkably, we're on time. And that's been nothing short of miraculous for this committee. If you would, please stand and raise your right hand to be sworn in. Do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And if so, please indicate by saying, I do.
I do.
Thank you very much. Mr. D'Incenzo, if you could begin for us today, we would appreciate it.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss rural broadband with the Senate Communications and Technology Committee. Sorry, I didn't use my microphone. My name is Jim D'Incenzo, and I'm the Vice President for State Government, Legislative, and Regulatory Affairs in the Northeast Division of Comcast, with responsibility for Pennsylvania and Ohio. Comcast is the leading provider of cable, entertainment, and communications products and services in Pennsylvania and the nation. Xfinity is involved in the deployment, development, management, and operation of broadband fiber optic networks and the delivery of programming content. Here in Pennsylvania, we have made over $5 billion in technology and infrastructure investments in the last 7 years alone. Our fiber optic rich network encompasses over 42,000 miles in the Commonwealth, and we pass more than 4 million homes and hundreds of thousands of businesses. Comcast has increased broadband speeds at no additional cost to our customers 17 times in the last 18 years. Our current subscriber plans deliver speeds as low as 15 megabits per second for residential and up to 100 gigabits per second Ethernet service for businesses. In 2009, just 10 years ago, our top speed offering was 50 megabits per second. Today, nearly every home and business that our network passes has access to 1 gigabit per second service. Let me repeat that. Almost every single home that we pass has access But I caution you not to confuse adoption versus availability. Just because it's available doesn't mean that people will subscribe to or adopt the service. In reality, several recent studies have shown that 20% of the homes that have access to high-speed internet do not purchase it at any speed. Comcast continually looks for areas in the Commonwealth to expand and upgrade our network. In May of this year, we announced the completion of the expansion and significant upgrade of our network in Senator Stefano's district in Somerset and Fayette counties. That project passed approximately 2,500 rural homes with 79 miles of new fiber construction. In addition to those investments, we recently extended our network 2 additional miles to reach the North Star Industrial Park in Somerset County. And during the last 2 years, Comcast has extended our Pennsylvania network by an average of over 700 miles and more than 33,000 additional passings each year. And we're on target for similar expansion in 2019. So you may be asking yourself, if you can do that there, why not everywhere? Well, the answer is simple, but it's a little bit complicated as well. So as you know, we're a publicly traded company, and we have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders, our owners. And in the areas of the expansion that I talked about, the return on investment was a positive number. But as you know, the cost to service a customer in less dense areas is significantly more expensive, and the ROI is a negative number regardless of how far out in time you model the project. These types of projects need a public-private partnership, such as Senator Langerholtz's Senate Bill 835. Bringing broadband service to Pennsylvania in unserved communities is a vital goal. To achieve this end, we need to start with an accurate, scientific understanding of where broadband exists today. Most importantly, and I think you've heard this in the last panel, we need to get mapping right. It's no secret that the mapping at the FCC is flawed, and as has been mentioned earlier, for instance, if one house or business in a census block is served, that census block is considered served. And in rural areas, census blocks, that's a huge geography area. So unfortunately, there are discussions in the U.S. House and the Senate and the FCC regarding shapefiles and crowdsourced mapping, which many believe will provide a more accurate picture of where service is available and at what speeds those services are available. Again, I urge you, do not conflate adoption speed versus the availability speed, as the recent report mentioned earlier, broadband availability and access in rural Pennsylvania did. So let's look at some facts. More than 95% of the 5 million homes in Pennsylvania have cable broadband access, and nearly 99% of those residences have the ability to purchase internet speeds of up to 1 gigabit per service. Yet many customers choose to purchase a service tier that is slower than the fastest service available to them, simply because it suits their needs. So let's take, for example, that I live a couple miles from here across the river. I have access to 1 gig service from Xfinity, and I also subscribe to it. But my neighbors have access to it, but they subscribe to services at lower speeds because that's what meets their needs. So this morning I performed a speed test on several different devices. I got widely different speed results. I still have 1 gig service. I know this because when I measured my Ethernet connection computer, I got 1 gigabit service through that. However, I used other devices, including my 6-year-old iPad, which topped out at a miserable low speed. If I had done the MLADS test using that device, it would say that I had very low speed, when in fact, I have 1 gigabyte service available to me, and I've subscribed to it. So in conclusion, I would advocate the following key principles in any rural broadband funding program. So there's really no such thing as an unserved area. One is either served with high-speed internet as defined by the federal government, or they're not served. That definition is 25.3 at the FCC. It's 10.1 by the federal government. While a whopping 96% of all homes in the Commonwealth have access to speeds equal to or greater than the FCC's threshold, that leaves about 200,000 to 300,000 residences, farms, and businesses who remain unserved, a significant number of people. So let's not confuse speed with what's available with what people purchase. It does nothing to further the advancement of rural broadband, and it doesn't help policymakers focus on using limited resources to get broadband to unserved areas. We believe that new mapping tools should help target these truly unserved areas, fixing the census block and other issues. Any program should have a dedicated state funding source. General appropriations or bonds would be appropriate. Any project must be technologically neutral and a level playing field. Any technology that works and efficiently solves the problem should be eligible to participate in any program. Should have a competitive bidding process for grant awards, ongoing transparency and accountability, no additional regulatory burdens, and let's make sure that taxpayer dollars are not squandered to overbuild in areas that are already served. I believe that Senator Langer holds to Senate Bill 835 encompasses many of these principles, and I offer our support for that bill. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to working with the committee and all stakeholders to further the dialogue and assist in advancing rural broadband in the Commonwealth.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kramer.
Good morning, Madam Chairwoman, Phillips-Hill, members of the Communications Technology Committee, and honored guests. My name is Scott Kramer, Principal IT Specialist of CETA Council of Governments and the Information Technologies Group. CEDACOG is a regional development district serving 11 counties in the central Pennsylvania. On behalf of CEDACOG and the nearly 750,000 residents of our region, thank you for this opportunity to testify today and share our perspectives on the critical broadband infrastructure needs in our region. We are a predominantly rural and historically defined by agriculture, anthracite coal, and manufacturing. Today, we are challenged to redefine ourselves by maintaining and growing our manufacturing sector while building our service industries. Like other LDDs, we look for the federal government to partner with us as we confront infrastructure challenges and expand economic development. Roads, bridges, sewer and water, and rail are important infrastructure needs, but high-speed broadband in our rural communities is just as important. According to the latest Federal Communication Commission data, over 600,000 Pennsylvanians still lack access to robust, reliable, high-speed internet, as defined as 25 megabytes down and 3 megabytes up. However, in June of this year, the Central Center for Rural Pennsylvania announced that the results of their year-long study on broadband in Pennsylvania. This study found there isn't a single county in the state where at least 50% of the population receive broadband connectivity as defined by the FCC. The research team collected more than 11 million broadband speed tests statewide and found that connectivity speeds were substantially slower in rural communities or counties than in urban ones. In addition, the research found that speeds were slower in rural areas, and the gap between speeds claimed by the internet service providers and the speeds experienced by the public were more pronounced in the rural regions. It's true that areas near large populations, employers, hospitals, and schools generally have adequate access to high-speed broadband. However, we found that those residing in the surrounding rural markets have inadequate or no high-speed internet access. ISPs, like most businesses, tend to focus their efforts on areas that are in high demand and profitable rather than the rural areas with the lower return on investment, much the same way the electric companies of the early 20th century approached providing power to the rural areas. Local governments, as well as businesses and residents, are placed in a disadvantaged position when faced with limited or no high-speed internet. Throughout Pennsylvania, rural areas are being impacted by inadequate broadband with increasing difficulty in attracting and retaining businesses and jobs and attracting and retaining residents, especially younger people who often do not want to live or work in areas with poor broadband. These changes are creating a negative tax base, negative tax base impacts for rural government. Rural areas are also geographically and statistically at a disadvantage due to the logistics required to deploy broadband in these areas. While the rural markets go unserved, advances in telemedicine and online classrooms continue to be more and more commonplace. School-aged children are now given laptops and tablets for schoolwork and are required to complete their homework assignments and projects online. This is not a scenario that is unique to Pennsylvania and will continue to grow over the coming years as the reliance to the ever-changing Internet of Things becomes more and more critical to everyday lives of PA residents. Communities across the United States have found themselves in similar situations and have gone to great effort to mitigate this, to mitigate the remaining demand. Some of them have even taken matters into their own hands, literally, and created the infrastructure to provide broadband to their residents. It is to this end CEDACOG has been focusing its efforts. Allow me to share a few examples of how CEDACOG has been addressing rural broadband in our region. Funded in part by the Appalachian Regional Commission and the participating counties of Clinton, Lycoming, Northumberland, and Union, CEDACOG has commissioned a study from Design 9 of Blacksburg, Virginia, to analyze regional broadband needs. Excuse me. The study will evaluate the current broadband infrastructure and services with a focus on business needs and will identify 3 key areas of need in each participating county. As a part of the data collection process, surveys of experiences from both businesses and residents regarding their current broadband connection or lack of such connection have been collected. These surveys are key to providing detailed broadband usage and coverage data needed to identify service gaps within the region. The completed study will provide local governments the tools necessary for making informed decisions regarding rural broadband in the region. We are presenting the full study findings this week to the counties and the public. However, I can highlight some key points. 88% of the respondents are interested in having access to gigabit fiber. 58% of the residents are not satisfied or only somewhat satisfied with their current internet service. 94% of the respondents agree that local government should help facilitate better internet access, and 30% indicate that the availability of broadband internet is affecting where they choose to live. In addition to our 4-county study, CEDACOG has been engaged with Juniata, Mifflin, and Perry counties to facilitate a dialogue amongst the local leaders, planning directors, emergency communication directors, and the local ISPs to address the lack of adequate broadband in the rural regions of each county. CEDACOG was aware of the county's tower assets due to prior projects with emergency communications, so our initial proposal to the counties was to leverage their existing vertical assets to build a county-operated wireless network capable of servicing the rural regions of the county. Alternatively, a point-to-point backbone network model was also proposed, which could then be leased to the local providers. Over the course of these meetings, we learned several key points. Our 3 counties, like most in our region, do not wish to be in the ISP business. ISPs are very hesitant to build out on networks they themselves did not build or control. And the lack of return on investment is the primary reason ISPs are not expanding in their service areas. So where do we go from here? How do we incentivize ISPs to build out in areas specifically rural where it might not be financially feasible for a traditional build-out? CEDACOG, with the support of regional legislators and the Pennsylvania Broadband Initiative, has secured $300,000 through the Keystone Communities Program for the purpose of facilitating the expansion of rural broadband. What we have proposed is, in addition to making the county-owned vertical assets available to the ISPs, to also establish a low-interest revolving loan fund for the purpose of incentivizing ISPs to provide a minimum of 25 megabytes down and 3 megabytes up service in the selected pilot project areas. Loan funds will be awarded via competitive RFP process as well as meeting the loan eligibility criteria. We feel this approach gives the providers the tools they need to expand their network infrastructure while creating a competitive environment for broadband access. In conclusion, how do we build a 21st century infrastructure for Pennsylvania? By working together through federal, state, local, and private partnerships that protect and enhance the infrastructure in which we have already invested, and by complementing that investment with new infrastructure that allows the region and its industries to remain competitive. Leadership is crucial in bringing this together, state and federal broadband initiatives. I'd like to acknowledge the efforts of Sherry Collins and the Pennsylvania Broadband Initiative and her role in spearheading this issue. However, as with any monumental task such as this, help is always needed. CEDACOG and the other rural CEDACOG and the other local development districts are here to help and assist in bringing fast, reliable internet service to the rural, underserved regions of Pennsylvania. Thank you for this opportunity to testify before you today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kilmer.
Good morning. Chairperson Phillips-Hill and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Bobby Kilmer, and I'm testifying today.
Could you turn the mic on?
Okay. I'm testifying today on behalf of the Fund for Northern Tier Development. The fund is a 501c4 organization that was formed by local business leaders to advocate for regional economic development, job creation, and educational priorities. We formed the fund in 2017 with an initial focus area of Bradford, Tioga, and Potter counties. And immediately upon our formation, we identified the lack of adequate communications infrastructure as a serious challenge facing our region. Our counties, along with other northern tier counties, have numerous areas without cellular service. And if you've ever spent any time driving across the northern tier, you've probably experienced those gaps. And many of our residents struggle with access to dependable, high-speed internet. I know that you've heard important testimony on this issue, and we share many of the concerns that have been expressed. And today, I'll just briefly highlight some of the ways that our region is affected. Workforce challenges are a serious issue in the northern tier. Many of our employers struggle to recruit and retain the employees they need to operate their businesses. It's always been a challenge to recruit folks to move to rural areas. And the lack of dependable broadband is seriously impacting our ability to do so. In years past, it used to be that the first question that a family would ask when they moved to our area would be, well, where's the nearest Walmart? Well, that's now been replaced by, could you tell me about the internet here in this location? Businesses are disadvantaged when they look to use tools like telecommuting or video conferencing to operate their businesses more efficiently and to give their employees flexibility. Also, e-commerce in our area is growing. I know many local folks who have entered that realm of e-commerce. It was a surprise to me, but you actually can make a living as a blogger or online marketer. And so those residents who live in communities without dependable broadband have to either go rent an office space where there is broadband availability, or it's just something that they can't explore. And then finally, you've heard from our educational community, but certainly from an adult perspective, it's difficult to take online classes or engage in other professional development opportunities without access to the internet. And again, just simple business operations are difficult without broadband. Everything from doing your banking and paying your bills all the way to having online enterprise systems, it's necessary to have internet access. I'm here on behalf of the Fund for Northern Tier today, but I wear another hat, and that is as the CEO of Claverack Rural Electric Cooperative. And we serve about 17,000 residents in rural Susquehanna, Bradford, and Wyoming counties. And not only do we see these challenges in our own operation, but I continually hear from our members who are angry and frustrated about the lack of dependable internet service. And many of these conversations include a plea for the cooperative to offer the service. As recently as Friday, I was contacted by one of our members in rural Bradford County, and his comment to me was, "This internet problem is going to put me out of business." He owns a precision machining shop that he grew from a part-time side business to a full-blown, full-time operation. He reports that his internet is usually only available around 4 o'clock in the morning when his neighbors are still in bed and not using the internet. If he needs access during the day, he has to take his cell phone and drive to the nearest hilltop where he can get adequate cell coverage in order to download plans, take orders, and get information and communication with his customers. He's continually in touch with his internet provider, who up to this point hasn't been able to offer a solution. And unfortunately, this story is all too common in northeastern Pennsylvania. I believe the committee has received testimony from other representatives of the Rural Electric Cooperative Program, and you've probably heard about the interest on the part of several of the state co-ops to help be part of the solution. An exciting development in our area is Tri-County Rural Electric's proposed fiber to the home project in Potter, Tioga, and western Bradford counties. Because of the capital investment required, it's important to know that this project is only possible because of the cooperative's success in the FCC's CAF2 auction, along with the Pennsylvania Broadband Investment Incentive Program. The cost of these projects, even for an electric cooperative that can utilize existing utility assets, is astronomical. Our cooperative commissioned a fiber to the home feasibility study in late 2017, and that projected a cost of over $60 million. So in the absence of supplemental funding, that project simply is not financially feasible. We're continuing to assess how we might be able to provide service to our members. We're also evaluating the construction of a fiber loop of our own to use for our electric facilities. And I would encourage you to speak with the representatives of the Pennsylvania Rural Electric Association. They've been working with the members to identify some of the challenges and barriers that some of the rural electrics might face if they would like to kind of get into the broadband arena. On a national level, our national association, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, is one of several groups who's advocating for reforms in the FCC's national broadband map. And again, if federal funding is going to be part of the solution, we definitely need to better understand who has service and who has not. Certainly, our experience in Bradford County has been consistent with the Penn State study. The Penn State study found a median download speed in our county of about 2.75 megabits per second. Due to the outpouring of concerns from public safety officials, businesses, and local residents, you may have heard about a project in Bradford County. The Bradford County Commissioners recently committed over $5 million of Act 13 monies towards a fiber optic middle mile project. And this open access network will consist of 3 loops of dark fiber that we're hoping can be used for emergency services, cell phone towers, and hopefully leveraged by internet providers to provide service to local businesses and residents. This is an example of the creativity and collaboration that will be needed to address the problem. We do believe that the Commonwealth will need to play a role in bridging the digital divide in our rural areas. Through direct investment, partnerships, and creativity, we support the efforts of the General Assembly as you look for solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to you all for your testimony. I'd like to ask all of you the same 2 questions that were asked of the earlier panel and have been asked at our other hearings as well. First, in your opinion, what are some of the regulatory barriers to deploying broadband to unserved and underserved areas? And second, what are your thoughts on the cost of bringing broadband to the entire Commonwealth?
So with regard to the regulatory issues, I wouldn't say it's so much regulatory issues as it is the cost of pole attachments. I mean, she mentioned it earlier that they're using their own utility easements, and it's still an astronomical cost. Just think what it would cost if somebody other than them came in and had to attach those poles at $25 a month. And additionally, right of way where there is no public right of way, so having to purchase or lease right-of-way from private property owners. I would say they're two of the largest problems that we at Comcast have faced. With regard to the cost, I have to agree somewhat with the previous panel. Number one, I'm a lobbyist. I have no idea in the world what the cost would be. But what I can say is that, and I know this from the projects that we have teed up, that so if you're dealing with a universe of about 200,000 to 300,000 homes, farms, and businesses that don't have adequate high-speed internet service that meets the FCC definition, I would say that maybe the first 250,000 of those properties would cost a heck of a lot less than the last 25%. And I believe that Senator Hill and Senator Stefano in our private conversations, I think I've used the example that we're looking at a project in Sullivan County that's about the same size as the project we did in Senator Stefano's district. We're about $1 million short of a positive return on investment. And we don't need $100 million for the project. We just need about $1 million to make it turn positive. So you'll go through many of those projects until you get to the project where there's one farm that's 4.5 miles away from everything else, and that in and of itself is going to cost a couple $100,000 just to provide service to that one farm.
I would also tend to agree with the previous panelists regarding the issues regarding regulation, pole attachment, engineering fees, attachment fees is astronomical. Also, there is leasing fees as far as the state-owned assets, the Pennsylvania State Police towers that's going through Crown Castle right now with their maintenance agreement. There is fees attached to that if a local service provider wanted to come in and hang equipment on those towers. So that can be looked at. As far as what it would cost to build out an entire, for all the rural regions of Pennsylvania, it's hard to say, but I can. The recent study that we did in the 4 counties in Clinton, Lycoming, Northumberland, and Union, we did have a cost analysis of potential technology build-outs, and one of them was a county-wide wireless internet infrastructure, not necessarily building the actual network, but building the infrastructure to allow local ISPs to come out and build off of them. And utilizing existing assets and identifying areas for new towers, I believe the average per county was anywhere from the $6 to $9 million range. And those are in those 4 counties.
So our perspective is slightly different on the pole attachment issue. The rural electric cooperatives are not governed by the same regulations that other providers would be governed by. So I know that our cooperative has tried to keep those attachment rates very low. We haven't changed our rates in probably 20 years. There is an issue if you're going to run fiber in rural areas. A lot of the infrastructure is older. A lot of those poles have been there since the 1940s and 50s. They're probably not high enough to accommodate, much of the attachments that are going on. So that's been my experience. As far as the total cost, again, a fiber project for our 3 counties was about $60 million. I know that the Tri-County project was over $80 million in total. So again, that doesn't even cover the entire northern tier. So the cost is going to be considerable, and I don't know that fiber to every location in the Commonwealth really is going to be feasible.
Thank you. And then one last question, if you could. What are some of the innovative tools or mechanisms that your organizations have been using that could potentially work throughout other parts of the state that would help further deploy broadband?
Like I mentioned in my testimony, Senator, we are rolling out a revolving loan, low-interest revolving loan fund it's a pilot project through the Keystone Communities program. And we're hoping that shows a very useful tool to expanding rural broadband. The input that we're getting from some of the ISPs that we've talked to already is that they are willing to come to the table and be involved with this. So we're hoping that that is going to be a useful tool in expanding rural broadband.
In Bradford County, I mentioned the open access project that's taking place, that's being funded partly by Act 13 monies. Again, that is not under construction yet, but we're very hopeful that that will be something that can be leveraged for both public safety and then eventually last mile provision.
We are sharpening our pencil and accepting less return on investment on these rural projects than we would in some other places.
Thank you very much. Chairman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Kilmer, it's interesting to hear that some of your counties are using Act 13 monies to help fund some of these projects. Do you have a sense of what the total amount of that revenue was?
I don't. I'm sure we could provide that, but I don't offhand.
Okay. The reason I ask is because actually one of the issues that Director Collins brought up at our first hearing out in Indiana County was the idea of perhaps using some revenue from the governor's Restore PA plan were that to pass. I support Restore PA, and I would, if it passed, I'd be open to that concept. But it strikes me in the interim, if the communities that would obviously benefit from this were interested, and there happens to be an overlap between many of the communities that get a lot of the Act 13 money and those that need broadband internet access, maybe one approach might be to take some of that money and, similar to the Restore PA plan, maybe monetize that over time to help fund some of the infrastructure that might be necessary. Do you have a sense of whether there'd be some interest in that in any of the counties that are affected?
I think that the cost would still be so overwhelming to provide internet that it may not be, it may put a dent in solving the problem, but I don't know that that would be the answer to divert that much of what would be needed from the Act 13 monies. That's just my initial sense.
And I understand that. I guess it really depends on what the total nut is at the end of the day, and then if it's monetized, what the return would be on that. Right. So, great. Well, thank you.
Well, I would like to thank everyone for participating in the final hearing on improving access to broadband throughout our Commonwealth, and I hope that moving forward we can find meaningful solutions to eventually close our digital divide. And I now recess the Senate Communications and Technology Committee until the call of the chair. Thank you again.